Today I'm here with Rhonda Miller, and she is the president of the Purple for Parents in Indiana. And I'm guessing a lot of people have never heard of Purple for Parents. So would you first kind of tell us what that is?
Sure. It's an organization that was fairly new, started in Arizona as an alternative to the teachers' union's Red for Ed movement. They started there and have been branching out across the country. And our organization actually started last fall here in Indiana by a former teacher named Jennifer McWilliams. She actually started the Indiana Coalition, or Indiana Purple for Parents. And I joined with her earlier this spring. And so we've been working together ever since, fighting for parental rights, school choice, and advocating for schools to not indoctrinate children or sexualize them.
Right, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about, and how a lot of people I don't think realize how the transgender issue plays into some of these issues, and
Right.
so I just kind of want to draw on your expertise in this area because you've been digging into some of these issues. And
Mhm.
one of the things that you mentioned that you were interested in talking about was how school counselors are influencing our children, and sort of the generally how schools have been put in this position of encouraging kids to transition, which is just such a strange development. I don't think anybody would have expected that 10 years ago, that schools would be actively trying to almost recruit kids to being transgender.
Yes. Yeah, so what happened was several years ago, our school passed a referendum, a tax referendum. And I had been doing enough research that I knew the language that was included in it was a little alarming. So I started doing some digging, filed some FOIA documents or requests, and uncovered a whole path of how this is getting into the schools and how they're advocating for school counselors, especially, and administrators to advocate for kids to become transgender and help them through the process instead of sending them the pathway of, your biological sex and getting them the therapy that they need for that. They're actually working with the schools. These organizations are, to advocate for them to push these kids into the transgenderism. And so what I did was I got all the FOIA documents, and I started reading through them, and I started seeing names and organizations and whatnot. So one in particular stood out, and the woman's name was Trish Hatch. So I started doing some research on her because I had no idea who she was, and come to find out she's a former former president, I think it is, of the American School Counselors Association, that repeatedly also came up in the FOIA documentation. And so I started doing some research into that because I didn't know what that was. And so that led me down a whole other trail of uncovering, okay, what are they really training the school counselors to do and the administrators? Because this agenda was bringing in not only the referendum money, but it also brought in what we called Lilly Counseling Initiative, which I don't know if you know Lilly Pharmaceuticals in Indianapolis, but they're a big, huge powerhouse down there near the State House, right across the street, pretty much. And so they had given an initiative to all the schools to compete for money, grant money, to implement these counseling initiatives. So that was all what led up to this referendum that was passed. And so when I started seeing that they were going to, do certain things with this referendum, I'm like, wait a minute. So that's why I filed the FOIAs, and I uncovered all this information. It led me into Asuka and Trish Hatch. And Trish Hatch, when I started digging into her, she is a friend of President Obama and Michelle Obama, and had put on a conference where they were advocating for these GSAs, the Gender Sexualities Alliance clubs in the schools. They were advocating for all this, gender confusion and gender agenda into the schools. And then I started digging into ASCA, and I found their position statements, which were very alarming. And I don't know if you've read through those or if you've even run across them, but when you start going through there, it's basically telling the counselors they play a major role in advocating for these kids to become transgender. If the child chooses to be transgender, then they are to advocate for them, and they are to give them all the rights, pretty much. And all the other kids, their rights don't necessarily matter. It's all focused on the transgender students. So it was very alarming what I was uncovering in there, because it included the bathrooms, it included the sports teams, it included overnight trips, it included all this information. So they're actually training, because this Trish Hatch through the Lilly Counseling Initiative, she was brought back here in the state of Indiana, where she was training all of our schools that got the grant money from Lilly. She's training them on all of these ASCA position statements, everything counseling, everything the radical agenda. So it opened up the door to this avenue being flooded into the schools, and the schools are so excited about being trained for this. And I have pictures of the PowerPoints when they're showing them on the screens of, they were actually teaching them the position statements, because I have one that said position statements, and I'm like, oh my word, they really are teaching them and training them on how to do this, along with, how to be a better counselor and everything else. So this Trish Hatch has written books. There are books there's one in particular called Pilots, Passengers, Prisoners, and Hijackers. So they're training the admin and the counselors to look at all their faculty in their schools, and they are going to set them into those 4 categories. They're either pilots, passengers, prisoners, or hijackers. And if you are considered a hijacker, which would be a teacher who's not willing to go along with, this agenda, then they would be considered a hijacker. And then there are steps that they will take to eliminate them or remove them from the school. I mean, it is nuts.
Oh,
But this all,
like, my head is so, like, I thought I had sort of heard it all, but this is like, it's even so much more insidious and so much deeper than even I had thought. The fact that pharmaceutical companies are funding therapists and training them to basically create clients for the pharmaceutical companies by being transgender, because we all know that if somebody starts down that path, they're likely to become a longtime customer for these pharmaceutical companies. And I can't imagine how did you handle this when it was coming in? Did you just, to me, I would have just been like, whoa, 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 whoa. What do you do with that?
Yeah, when the referendum was passed, I didn't know any of that information beforehand. I knew enough that I knew the referendum was not good. And so once the referendum passed, I had tried to push back on it and said, look, this is not good. They're going to bring in, this is going to take away parental rights. That was my main concern when it comes to this whole transgender issue. And that's just one piece of it, right? So once the referendum passed is when I filed the FOIA, and I got binders of information and all these emails and all these graphs and charts and names of tracking platforms that they're using on the kids. If they're going to create the schools to be safe schools, and by doing that, then they will send the kids surveys, and they will learn how to manipulate their thinking and through these platforms to make the schools LGBT transgender safe for those kids. That's basically.
I want to say safe, because really this is not safe for kids.
No.
This is horrible. This is just completely harming the kids, their educational experience. This is not an area that schools should be involved with at all. And so it's hard for me to even imagine how anybody justifies this. But then when you see where the money is coming from, it kind of makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. Because Lilly is big into the pharmaceutical realm of it, and they stand to gain a lot of money with all these kids being on the hormones and cross-sex hormones and whatnot. So it was very eye-opening, and it took me 3 months. I spent 3 months at night going through all the documentation, and just was on my computer repeatedly looking to see what avenues were coming in, and all this money was leading down all these different rabbit holes. And it was very, very alarming what I was finding. And so I put together a PowerPoint, and I started reaching out within my community. I had some of my members of my community at my home, and I showed them the PowerPoint presentation. They were floored. They had no idea that was what was driving the referendum, because in the FOIA documents, it said they only got the grant money for so long, and then they had to find a way to make it sustainable. Well, you can't make this humongous monster sustainable without raising taxes and creating more tax revenue to do so. So that's what led to the referendum. And so in that 3 months from like January to probably March, the end of March, I spent uncovering all of this information and just reading through all of the American School Counselors Association, and then finding out they're tied to all these other agendas with transgender movement and the radical left movement. And so it really opened up a whole different avenue as to how to better understand how it's infiltrating the schools.
Well, and it's so scary because I think one of the things that I keep hearing is we need more counselors in the school. You know, we have all these kids, they're suicidal. We need more counselors in the school. And I, you know, probably a couple of years ago would have thought, oh, of course, that's what we need. But now I'm thinking we need fewer counselors in the schools. Maybe we don't need any. Maybe we just need, you know, career counselors and college guidance counselors, but to have actual counselors in there who are working therapeutically in some manner with our kids, I think it's incredibly concerning. And it reminds me of a situation that happened here in Utah this spring, where a child on a senior page actually wrote, I believe it was, that there are only two genders and there are a lot of confused people. That's what he wrote. And the way the school responded to that was to make their school counselors available on an emergency basis for kids who were traumatized by this. And I'm thinking, if we've gotten to the point where, first of all, that's how a school administrator responds to something like that, and then knowing that school counseling agencies and organizations are so embracing this ideology, it scares me so much.
It absolutely does. And here's the other thing that we started looking at and started watching. It was this number of schools that are now putting in, mental health or medical institutions in the schools. So then the parents, at some point, there's going to be, the kids are going to be sent there without parental consent. And so that is very serious concern when I'm seeing all of the documentation from, American School Counselors Association. And then there's a manual that is used to guide schools down this path. And they're basically threatened, if you don't comply, you'll be sued. And in this manual, they teach the administrators in the schools that teachers will go to the court to testify against the parents. If the parents do not comply with this, the teachers will go to court and testify against the parents. It's very alarming.
Wow. And so in lots of places, the school boards are starting to secretly and sort of subtly pass policy that actively undermines parental authority and actively encourages teachers to undermine parents. And I was wondering, have you seen that in Indiana?
Yes, we have. In fact, we had two incidences last school year. So the first one happened around Christmas time of 2018. Okay. So we got wind of a place in Manchester, which is near Fort Wayne. I don't know if you're familiar with Indiana, but there's a school over near Fort Wayne that they had a first grader who was a boy transitioning to a girl. And so he was being allowed into the bathroom and whatnot. And it created a huge firestorm over there. In fact, Nate Gabhart, the father who stood up against that, he was actually on national news, I think even, but what they did was the school board wasn't going to cave. They were sticking with their decision to do this. And so they decided they were going to have a public meeting so that the parents could address the concerns. So what they really did was they brought everybody in, but they had the Indiana State Teachers Association there. They had the teachers union. They had a girl from the Bowen Center, which is a mental health facility that's well known in our area. They had her there. She gets up and she starts showing the parents the unicorn, and so it was so crazy because she was advocating for this, right? And the parents really did not have much say. By the time she got up, the parents walked out. Half the room just got up and walked out, and they stood firm. They were not going to cave. And in fact, the last I heard, Manchester Schools was losing like $1 million because they lost so many kids over their decision to do that, and they were not going to back down. And then shortly after that scenario, we had another school not far from, about another hour away probably. They were doing the same thing in their high school. So we were contacted, or I was contacted by the parents there and said, they're doing that here. What do we do? So we talked through some strategies, and they said, will you come down to the school board meeting? So absolutely, I'll come. So it's a 2-hour drive from me. So I drove down to the school, sat with them through the school board meeting. They did a great job, the parents did, of getting enough parents there and community members that were standing against it. And we believe that the school board had watched what had happened in Manchester. And so they knew what a firestorm it created, and because it went on social media, it went public. They didn't get to keep it private. And so we were there to stand with these parents, and they packed this room. And I will give the school board credit. They let every one of those parents and community members speak, and they were very patient with them. And it was interesting to watch, because you don't usually see a school board divided. They will usually show a united front. Well, these parents had one, possibly two allies on the school board. And one of them actually went after the lawyer who had read Mary McAllister from Bernadette Boyle's organization. She had written them a letter stating that how they were applying Title IX was wrong, and how they didn't have a right to do this, and they needed to protect the other students' privacy. And so the lawyer was reading this through the school board meeting, and the one board member, when he was done, he had the same letter on his iPad, and he looked right at that lawyer and he went toe to toe with him right in the middle of the school board meeting, which was very unprecedented. And then he addressed the superintendent and went head to head with him. And I told them, I said, that's unprecedented. But thankfully, there was enough school board members that were seeing the parents' side of things, that they were trying to stand with them. Now, the superintendent was digging his heels in, and he was not being cooperative with the parents. And I don't know where his influence came from, but there was one in the audience, there was one male student, who got up and said, what about my rights? How are you going to protect me and my privacy? And so that was very powerful when you get a student who was willing to do that and put themselves out there. And he was, and even the one board member commended him for being there, because that meant a lot to them to hear from a student, their perspective. And so they had reversed course later on after that, but it was 2 incidences back to back, about an hour apart. And I'm sure it's going on across the state. We just have only heard about those 2 incidences, but you had 2 different strategies, one back down and one stayed the course, and they ended up losing a lot of money because parents pulled their kids out.
Yeah, I think I would definitely pull my kids out, either find them a different district or consider homeschooling them, because there's just no way I would want my kid exposed to teachers who are actively willing to undermine. And that's the shame of this, is that the teachers who aren't willing to buy into this agenda, it sounds like, are getting terminated, that the school districts are actively getting rid of them. So there really aren't going to be teachers there who are going to look out for the best interests of kids.
Right. And it's they'll either get rid of them or they will silence them. A lot of the brave teachers are afraid to speak out. And we've got a lot of good teachers that have gotten into the system, not realizing, the history of public education. When you start delving into, where it all started and where it was meant to go to begin with, there are many good teachers that went into profession to help kids and help them learn. And now they're caught in a system that is not conducive to a lot of their personal beliefs, their religious beliefs. And so they're going to be targeted. I have friends who are public school teachers that are very concerned, and they know they have to be very, very careful.
I'm so saddened by this. I mean, one of the things that I keep thinking is that as a result of the FERPA, I think it's FERPA, regulations, that if you have say a daughter who's going on an overnight trip, and there happens to be someone who's transgender going along the trip, that you as a parent will not know that. So there's a potential that your child will be sharing lodging, sharing restrooms, sharing locker rooms with a biological male, and you would not know that. And to me, that is just such a violation of a parent's right to know about their child's safety and privacy. And the regulation was originally sort of to prevent teachers from giving out information about like grades and other things that might be personal information, to not make that public. But in this case, those regulations are protecting people who are pushing this trans agenda, because it prevents parents from finding out if there are transgender kids in the classroom with their kids.
Mhm. That is absolutely true, Erin. In the ASCA position statements, it spells it out in there too. You can read through those. And in addition, we have a schools in transition manual. I don't know if you've read that or if you've heard of it, but that is the manual I referred to a little bit ago. That, yeah, I mean, the schools are guided through this manual that's written by the NEA, and various other organizations that guides them how to protect the student, and the privacy, and if on these overnight trips and whatnot, and how other students who are uncomfortable with that, they're the ones that are supposed to go use a separate facility or be kept separate than everybody else, not the confused transgender student, which, you know, is very alarming, because they're being told to keep this information private from parents, and
And that's
parents don't
so,
know.
it's so manipulative to say, if you're the one who's uncomfortable, it's your problem. So basically they're telling, especially girls, but basically boys and girls, that if they want to protect their privacy, there's something wrong with that. And that they're the ones who have the problem. They're the ones who need the accommodations. And I can't imagine how that would silence kids, because you don't want to be that kid who's labeled as transphobic. You don't want to be that kid who is seen going into the teacher's bathroom because you're uncomfortable going into your own bathroom. That's just incredible peer pressure on a kid. So I would imagine there are a lot of kids who are uncomfortable with this who would never speak out.
And that is exactly right. And in fact, in the school's transition manual, it talks about the students' bias. It's their bias because they feel that way. If it doesn't matter if their religious convictions, teach them that is a lifestyle that's not conducive to the Bible. They have a bias and a prejudice.
Or Muslims, I'm guessing. There are many religions who who really aren't comfortable having males and females in these vulnerable private spaces together.
Correct. You're absolutely correct. And they're saying, regardless of your religious beliefs, that is a prejudice and a bias that you have to overcome. You have to learn to embrace this gender ideology. Is basically what this. You really should read it. It's a very interesting and very eye-opening manual, but it's being used to implement this stuff on the schools. And it says in there, when the parents aren't complying with this, then they consider it a danger to these transgender students, and so they can be called in to testify in court.
So basically, children and parents and teachers who don't agree that it's appropriate for someone to say that they were born in the wrong body, or to claim that they are something that they're not, that they're the ones who are labeled as bigots. And what was the term that you used?
Bias and prejudice.
Bias and prejudice. They're bias and prejudice. Is there a link to that manual that you could share?
Absolutely.
Okay, I'll include that in the description of this.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I'm wondering is, is Indiana one of the states that has passed so-called conversion therapy bans? Because that's another issue that's playing into this, is that in many states they're using this term conversion therapy, and what it really is it's actually it's a therapy ban for therapy that will help people, specifically children, a lot of times, to resolve those very difficult dysphoric feelings. And instead, in my view, they're being converted to being transgender because of these laws. They're banning therapists from helping these kids. But the language is so convoluted, so people think that they're banning these really heinous kinds of therapy, when in fact, it's talk therapy that help children to identify the underlying issues that are causing them to have that gender dysphoria.
Mm-hmm. Yes, we have actually a senator in Bloomington, from the Bloomington area, which, if you're familiar with Bloomington, you also know that's where the Kinsey Institute is at. And so he's quite a liberal, and he has authored it. I think he authored it the 1 year, and we targeted it immensely as soon as he did, because what we did was we used a lot of the information that came out of the video that you were able to join in with Family Watch International and Dr. Catella, And so we were able to use a lot of that language and say, if you push for this, you are pushing for the sterilization of children. And so when you get people to understand that, in fact, that's what I did at the school board meeting I went to. I spoke to the school board and said, you need to understand, when you advocate for this, you are advocating for the sterilization of children. And I'm finding that when you come at it from that approach, they don't think of it in those terms, and they're not thinking of it as, the scientific side of it on that end. And you get them to start thinking and taking a step back. And I do think that's why that school reversed course on their decision. But it's very telling when even parents and even community members, because they're not thinking of it that way either, and they start realizing, oh my word, now you're talking about a whole different ball game in addressing the transgender issue, and it comes down to sterilizing children. I mean, that's just wrong. It's ethically wrong on so many levels.
And I can't imagine, most parents, I mean, most people, if they realized that our schools are now actively involved in facilitating the sterilization of children. That's what's happening. And not just the sterilization of children, but other incredible harms that can come from puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, and surgeries, mutilating their bodies, becoming lifetime addicts of these hormones. I mean, when you start putting it in that language, people's ears perk up and they're like, what are you talking about? Sterilizing kids? Because I've yet to meet anybody who would advocate sterilizing kids. But it's because that they've controlled the language, and we haven't done a good job of stealing it back. But I think you've hit upon it, that language is so powerful. And if even teachers really understood the implications, if administrators, if parents, I mean, I think that's the way to fight back.
It is. And when I go to speak, I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I will show, before I do this section on Lily and the counseling money and the ASCA and all of that, I show the video from Family Watch International that you're in, that Walt Heyer's in, that Dr. Cottella's in, because it's very, very powerful. And you can just hear the gasps when people realize that is the real agenda with all of this. And then they take a look back, and then I show them how it's infiltrating the schools and the people, coming into the schools themselves. And you get them to understand this is, you had mentioned it with Bernadette, I think one of you did, about it's really a eugenics. That's what it comes down to. And when you get them looking at it from that perspective, it really opens their eyes, and they're able to see and understand the truth. Because you're right, we have not done a very good job of using the right language. And the other side does. I mean, they've been at this for decades, while we've all been living the American dream and not realizing that our country has been infiltrated. They have been out there advocating and pushing for this stuff, and it's now come to the forefront. And so we're seeing decades of the manipulation that we're now having to catch on to and learn to catch up and overcome it.
Well, and it's so powerful, because I keep running into people like me who identified as liberal for most of their lives, who are suddenly sort of having the lights go on, and they're seeing what's happening, and it's horrifying. And we're just like, how did we not know that was going on? And one of those, when I was actually talking to a mom the other day, and we were talking about how we both were so 100% behind Obama. We thought he was great. And now I realized that it was the Obama administration that did the Dear Colleague letter that opened up bathrooms and locker rooms and overnight facilities to anybody who self-ID'd as transgender. And I realized that it was because of the Affordable Care Act that transgender people are now able to get these kind of treatments, and that children are able to be sterilized at the government's bill. The government's picking up the tab to sterilize our kids. And for many of us, it's just, it's sort of one of those times where we just think, how on earth did I not have any clue about this? And looking back, I always say I feel like a woman whose husband's been cheating on her. It's that kind of feeling of just going, wow, I had no idea. And I think there are a lot of us who are waking up to it. And then there are a lot of you who have been watching it progressing and wondering when we were going to wake up.
Well, I have to be honest with you. It wasn't until probably 7, 8 years ago that I realized something was going wrong with education. And I started with my daughter's, I wanted her government book because I thought there was some stuff in there that I would find. I found it in her environmental science book. And I copied the first 3 chapters. I mean, it was just anti-American, anti-capitalist, anti-this, anti-that, everything we stood for. And so that's what sent me on the trail of what was going on in education. And then I stumbled across the whole sex education. And I remember having, when I had found it was going to come through social studies. And so I had a conversation with my son's public school principal at that point and said, look, he's not learning this. And I know it's coming. And I had just hit the tip of the iceberg. And then I just kept digging and digging. And I stumbled upon everything else. And then, found the transgender issue tied to it. And, people don't realize that this whole movement is going to, next it'll be pedophilia. I mean, once they've gone down this path and they've, everybody's gotten adjusted to that, then it'll be pedophilia. And that seems where people are really, really waking up. You
Well,
teach
and
them.
I think they're already, like, one of the things people ask me what's going on, and I just keep thinking the reason that they're taking away consent from the parents and giving it to kids is that if you start giving kids medical consent, then it's not that far to allow them to have sexual consent. And I really feel like that's part of the underlying. You mentioned Kinsey. The motivation under this is to really legitimize pedophilia. And now we see pedophilia as minor attracted persons and considered a sexual orientation, and therefore it's going to be protected under a lot of these laws if people start recognizing it as a sexual orientation.
You're absolutely right. And you are seeing states already starting to lower that consent rate or that consent age. In fact, when Kinsey released his books, that sent the whole wave of the sexual revolution. And he was working with many big, powerful people when he did that. So they were ready when his books released. And then they come with the publicity side of it with all their money. And you could see the change. I mean, Dr. Reisman has said you can change, you can look at our society and you can slice it in 2, basically, pre-Kinsey, post-Kinsey, because it happened so fast. It changed all of our laws, the age of consent, the obscenity exemptions that states now allow for schools, which is another thing that is just very interesting to go down and see what happens in each state with that. But it led to this where we are now with the whole transgender issue and the confusion. He worked with John Money, who was one of the first ones to perform transgender surgery on 2 twin boys that was devastating for them and their family. And so yeah, his ties into this whole thing are enormous, and Hoosier taxpayers pay for it. And we had no idea. And I had no idea until several years ago. And so, yeah, it's educating everyone to make sure that they understand this is where we are because of what happened before. And this is where we will go if we don't stop it. And pedophilia will be next. And you'll see we already are seeing a rampant sex trafficking industry that is overtaking drug industry because of the sexual revolution and what happened. And so,
well, and also I've noticed that one of the big tenets of the transgender movement is also to glorify sex work, and this is one of their big pushes is to glamorize it, to make it, it just shocks me that growing up that I was taught that being a homemaker was not a legitimate choice for a career. But now children are being taught that sex work is. And I just think we have gotten things so messed up at this point. And one of the things I wanted to touch on is the Equality Act, because we've been talking about local issues, but the Equality Act is a national resolution that has already passed Congress. And if it goes through, it's going to open the doors to all of this. It's going to open the doors to requiring therapists to affirm children in every state, to potentially recognizing pedophilia as a sexual orientation, which would be protected, and that it would be considered a hate crime if you were to somehow get in some kind of an altercation with a pedophiliac, because they would be protected. And to me, I just can't even figure out how it is that they've gotten to this point, but people don't understand. and they hear Equality Act and they think, oh yeah, that sounds good. We want everybody to be treated equally. And they don't look at the language and they don't understand the implications.
That's very true, and that is exactly what will happen. You're 100% correct, and so that's why it's imperative that we try to reach as many people as we possibly can, and everybody included. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of the Save the Children marches and rallies, even here locally. I mean, I'm amazed at the number of people who are out there. They're waking up, and I think the transgender movement was probably the next stepping stone, but when it hit pedophilia, I think that's a whole other ballgame that parents are not going to sit back and let happen. They're going to protect their children at all costs. And I think their eyes are probably being more opened now to realizing, okay, this was the next step from transgender. I mean, they were after that. Now it'll be this, and there's no stopping it. Once you hit pedophilia, I mean, it's game over, really. I mean, they're going to be after all the children. I mean, we've now got parents that are so frightened to go to the grocery store because their kids, could be abducted, and realizing how that actually works and how they actually target kids in the parking lots. I mean, it's crazy. And so understanding how each one of these sexual revolution issues has led and compiled on the other is definitely eye-opening to a lot of people to understand.
Yeah, it's really to me. I had no idea. I mean, it really has been. It's been in some ways just incredibly heartbreaking, because a lot of us who were identified as liberals, one of the reasons that we identified as liberals is because we care about kids. We love kids. We want to protect kids. We want to make sure they're cared for and fed. And now I realize that was in a lot of ways undermining parental authority. And once it's really telling to me that one of the things that the transgender movement and the LGBTQ movement says to kids over and over and over again is that if your family doesn't affirm you, go find another family. And teachers are told if the parents don't affirm them, then you separate them from the parents and you deceive the parents. And it really is, if you can make it so that parents don't have authority over their kids anymore, then anything goes.
That's absolutely true. And what we're finding is the schools are playing a major, major role in that. When they have the gender sexuality, the GSA clubs, they'll pull kids aside into that, and indoctrinate them with the LGBT agenda that way. And then they also teach the other kids to be allies and then to be advocates. Get them in and teach them how to, sympathize and become allies, and then send them back out into the school and into the community and start advocating for, we need this, we need that, we need, safe schools this, safe schools that. And not realizing that they're using our children as little advocates and little revolutionaries is very, very frightening. And the other thing that we uncovered through another scenario at our local school was the books that the kids are given to read. They're loaded with this agenda, this greater agenda, whether it be social justice, whether it be restorative justice, anti-bullying, in the pornography. I mean, the porn that is in these reading books that the kids are given to do projects on was very eye-opening. I mean, even in the middle of a very, very conservative community, which is where we live, to see what happened with that. And then you've got some members in the community that should know better. We're advocating the kids read these books because it created conversation.
And I think that's one thing I wanted to mention is if somebody's watching this and they just think, oh, these two prudes, they're worried about sex education. I just want to just say that if you have that opinion, you need to look at what your sex ed is teaching. They are teaching kindergartners to masturbate. They are teaching elementary school kids about anal sex. A lot of the diagrams, as you mentioned, the diagrams and the materials they're giving kids would be considered pornographic. They would likely be taken down from social media because they would violate those standards. This is not the kind of sex ed that we had when we were kids. This is an indoctrination, and it's basically telling kids that they are sexual from birth, and that really if they want to say no to sex, that there's something wrong with them, and they're shaming the other person almost. There's these new words, whore shaming and slut shaming, that children are taught that if they don't want to engage in this behavior, that they're somehow bigots or they're somehow prejudiced. And it's no wonder all these girls are deciding to transition. My goodness, if you're a little girl and you're basically taught that anal sex and vaginal sex and oral sex are all things that you should be excited to perform anytime somebody wants you to, no wonder they're transitioning and deciding to present as male.
That's so true. Absolutely. And to see at what level that's coming through. I mean, you've got preschool books, you've got, junior high readers, you've got young adult readers that are including all of this information and all of this, material that the kids are reading, and the parents have no idea. They're in the school libraries, they're in the public libraries. And the interesting thing was about what we understood when we fought for our parental rights bill in 2018 here, to protect kids against this. We took a look at our obscenity exemption, and there's a movement now to try and reverse those, because that was one of the first things that was put into place when Alfred Kinsey wrote his books. Was 43 states then started applying obscenity rules and obscenity exemptions for schools and public libraries. So that allows them to bring this information in under educational purposes, is what they get away with it. But it's not education, it's porn. I mean, kids are reading masturbation, they're reading, there's very, very descriptive details that are in these books. I have excerpts from what happened at our school of what parents were finding inside these books. It's disgusting. There's no way that should ever be available to a student in a school on taxpayer dollars. It's crazy. But when you look at our statute in Indiana, the obscenity exemption, you look at the statute just above it, you cannot display, sell, rent, or distribute that kind of material within 500 feet of a church or school, or it's a felony.
Wow.
But yet you can allow it into the classroom for educational purposes.
It almost makes me wonder if we just make lots and lots of copies of those and just start handing them out to people and seeing the reaction. Because I know my reaction, and I have, it's not like I'm a prude. I have I don't know how to say it, but I feel like it's hard to shock me. My life experience has been such that I feel like I've seen and heard it all, and yet what I'm seeing and hearing that they're teaching, little tiny kids, it just makes my skin crawl.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, the younger you get them, the better, because they'll be so groomed. I mean, the law enforcement calls this sexual grooming of children.
Well, and
so,
the teachers, the teachers are grooming them by saying, this stays here, don't tell your parents what
right.
goes on here. They're teaching these kids to keep secrets from their parents, which is what a predator does.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And then you've got teachers also that will be trying to groom them for, transgendering, or, this whole thing. They'll pull them aside and try to do that. We've had situations where that's been the case too. And you've got a huge explosion of, teacher student sex crimes now. I mean, it's crazy how that has all infiltrated. And it's basically, the schools have now become, unfortunately, like these sexualized indoctrination camps. I mean, really, you put your student in there, inside those walls. A lot of times you can't get in. They won't let you in, or they'll let you in, but it's under very strict guidelines. And then you have no idea what your student's actually learning inside that building for, the 8 hours that they're there. And then they come home, and they're anti-parental. Then they're arguing with you. I mean, it's crazy. And then people are wondering why we're seeing the things play out in our city streets that we're seeing right now. And it's
and the thing is that the kids come home and they're anxious and depressed, and they're not talking to their parents because they've been told that their parents are the bad guys. So then the parents take them to therapists, and the therapists do the same thing. And so I just feel like this is such an attack on parenting, and it's so sad because the parent-child relationship is so important. But they're actively trying to break that right now. And it just, my advice to parents at this point is to homeschool if you can. And if not, make sure you're in that school a lot.
Yep, absolutely. We pulled our son out and put him in a private school, and he's been in a private school ever since, where I know his education is safe. where he's actually in a safe school, right? Because I don't want him in a school where he's going to be indoctrinated and he's going to be filled with all of this, anger and rage and sexualized. I don't want my high schooler reading porn. Yeah,
or your elementary school. I mean,
right. Yeah.
or your
My son's high
preschool.
school.
I mean, gosh. I mean, at this point,
Absolutely.
it's preschool. So,
Yeah.
so you have done an amazing job of finding out what's going on in your schools and following it to where the money comes from. Eli Lilly, pharmaceutical companies, not surprising. So what advice do you have for those of us watching this who are just thinking, oh my gosh, that can't be happening in my school? Or, oh my gosh, is that happening in my school? What advice do you have?
Yeah, so on our platform, on our social media platform, we've had a lot of people asking that question lately. And so my advice is start finding out what your curriculum is. File Freedom of Information Acts. We're finding that schools are pushing back on it, but you are legally entitled to see that information. Go in and look. But what we're also finding is that a lot of times what the parents are given is not the full curriculum. So you've got to keep digging and you've got to get to the bottom of it. Don't let up. These are your kids. And that's it. You pay the school. They work for you. You don't work for them. And if you're not satisfied and you're still not getting results, then by all means, you have the right to pull your child, because when you put them in these schools, you are literally gambling with dice on how they're going to come out.
And don't assume that you just get the sexual education curriculum, because as you said, this is now nested in all areas of the curriculum in ways that you would not even imagine. And so you need to look at all of the curriculum, and especially anti-bullying, anything having to do with anti-bullying. That's one area that they've really been able to infiltrate. But it's in history, it's in science, it's in math, in places that you wouldn't even imagine. Some of the math problems that I've seen that are, like, how many condoms does Joe need if he's going to have, two partners tonight and 3 partners tomorrow night? I mean, it's really, it's that crazy. And so it's great to go and look at and see. But the other thing that I believe it was Bernadette who said that sometimes teachers have private files that they are not required to share with parents, even if the parent goes in and tries to see that child's file. So any advice in that situation?
That is also true. And if you read through the ask a position statements and the Schools in Transition manual, which I will send you the link to, both of those, if you read through those, yeah, that is absolutely true. They do have separate files and separate entities that they keep the students' information in. And parents are going to have a tough time, but they can file a FOIA with it, and the school has to provide it. I mean, all else, get a lawyer. Get a lawyer. That's what Bernadette and Mary McAllister are for. I mean, and others. I mean, that's an issue that is worth fighting for. And that's what it's going to take until parents actually stand up and say, not my children, not on my watch. You're not going to get away with it. The schools are going to continue to push the envelope, unfortunately. And they're being trained to do so.
Yeah, and there's a lot of money behind it. So anything else that you want to just words of wisdom or advice or thoughts that you want to end with?
Just the sooner and the more we learn about what is really happening with this, education is not what we thought it was. I mean, the agenda with education goes back decades. They knew what they were doing with it. And then Kinsey comes along, and then he, set off the sexual revolution, which is what we are seeing. This is the LGBT and the transgender and now the pedophilia is all part of what was kicked off back in 1948 and 1953. And so we are just now, many Americans are just now realizing this is what has been taking place. And so we need to come together. We need to start standing up and saying, not our children. They're our children, not yours. And we are not going to have you doing this to them, and holding their schools accountable. Their schools accountable, their legislatures accountable, their governors accountable. We, as Americans, our country was set up as a republic. We have the right to hold our elected officials responsible for what they're doing. And until we do that, this agenda is going to continue. And I hope that more Americans will start standing up as we're starting to see now. So I'm encouraged by that, but that's what it's going to take.
Well, and I'm so glad that you're doing this. Rhonda, I just I'm grateful for what you found out, for the fact that you're fighting for our kids, and I hope that you'll inspire other parents to start looking around and to start questioning and to start pulling their kids if they're not happy with what's happening in the schools.
Thank you. I am too. It's a fight we're all a part of, because it's our country, it's our kids, and our future.
Well, I'm as difficult as some of the information that you've shared is, I do feel hopeful because I just feel like there are people like you out there who are willing to get their hands dirty to figure out what's going on, and then to help those of us who need to be kind of guided a little bit to figure out what we need to do. So that gives me a lot of hope. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Erin.